I'm Kier from In Defense Of, a podcast member of the Gonna Geek Network, just like the one you're listening to now. The opinions expressed are those of each individual. Check out all the other podcasts at GonnaGeekNetwork.com and get ready, because geekiness begins in 3, 2, 1.
Welcome to Better Podcasting, a show where we talk about podcast tips, tools, and best practices to help you succeed with your podcast. What makes us different? Well, just like you, we podcast purely out of the love and fun of it. Podcasting is our hobby, and we recognize that it's yours too. We always encourage your questions and feedback, and you can find all of our contact information at betterpodcasting.com. Here's your host for the show, Stephen John Drew and Stargate Pioneer.
Hello and welcome to episode 23 of your favorite podcasting podcast. This is Better Podcasting. My name is Stephen John Drew, and with me is the great, the legendary, the heroic Stargate Pioneer.
SP's in the house. We are all good. We're all safe. I'm here to protect everyone. I'm here. I'm the talent. I'm the entertainment. I'm the one that everybody comes to listen to. Nobody cares about Steven, even though he is very energetic.
Bye.
All right. So today on Better Podcasting, number 23.
One of these days I'm going to open up the Better Podcasting being very subdued. It'll be like, hello and welcome to your evening podcasting audio theater.
With the NPR voice.
Exactly.
I did that on Starling Tribune last night. It was great. Nobody caught it either. Nobody's like, hey, SP's what's wrong or anything like that. It was just, and the Arrow episode that we were podcasting on was very controversial.
It was.
And so it was a nice difference. So that's from the production standpoint. Always remember, if you slightly change your intro, your outro, anything with your podcast, just change the tone a little bit, your listeners will eventually listen to you and understand why you changed your tone.
Yeah, for sure. So we are back with another edition of Better Podcasting. And as we launched the previous week, we have a brand new contest. As you may recall, we did give away an Audio-Technica ATR 2100 USB/XLR microphone. This was a microphone that we elected to give away because we quite liked it and we felt very good about it. So then we thought, what else should we give away? Let's give away something else we really like, which is a Logitech C920. That's right. That is one of the leading webcams right now. If you are doing a video podcast, or maybe you're just video chatting, I'm sure you have a use for this thing here. So we are giving one away. Again, just like the previous contest, this is not sponsored at all by the manufacturer. This is something that SP and I just feel so good about this camera. We want to make sure that we do give it away to one lucky Better podcaster. So SP, why don't you tell everybody exactly how they can enter?
So they can enter to win this wonderful Logitech Charlie 9er20 by telling us about at contest at betterpodcasting.com. Tell us about your first non-adult, family-friendly webcam experience, and remind everybody of what you would do with the C920. Are you going to mount it on your monitors? Are you going to mount it on a tripod? Are you going to mount it on a permanent stick around you? So monitor, mobile, or mount on a permanent mount. And I actually have a permanent mount off to my left, or actually off to my right, off to your left as you're looking at me. And it's right there. We'll have to show it one of these times with the second camera. And it is wonderful. It's got a screw in on the bottom, so you can actually mount it to a tripod just like any normal camera or whatever. It's USB. It's got 1080 on it. It does take some processing horsepower. So if you don't have it's not the latest and greatest, but if you have like a 10-year-old computer, it's not going to work with that. But if you have a decently running computer, it'll work and it'll give you the great video. We're both using Logitech C920s to record this, and that's our main camera. So It's a great camera. So once again, your first webcam experience that's family friendly. And is it monitor, mount, or mobile that you would be using the one that you get? And once again, that's contest at betterpodcasting.com.
And one thing that I just want to remind everybody about, one of the great things with this webcam is the fact that it actually uses a standard tripod threading. So if you have any tripod equipment, whether it's a tripod, maybe it's a selfie stick that uses the standard camera thing, you could totally put your C920 on your selfie stick and hold it the entire hour that you podcast.
Sweet. Let's do that next time. Let's selfie stick our video.
I love it. We should do it. Maybe we'll make it happen. It's going to be very, very tiresome. But
it's like that shaky cam going the entire time.
Exactly. But you will be limited to your cord space, of course. But please email us, contest@betterpodcasting.com. And as we mentioned last time, this will run until the end of May 2016. So you've got yourself a couple of months, unless you're listening to this in the future, and then, you should have time traveled back 3 years or something like that. So
yeah, just, call up Barry Allen. He'll be able to time travel you. Yeah.
Barry, I need your help. I need to go win a camera. But before we do get into the main topic, I want to make sure everybody does remember we are part of the Gonna Geek Network, and the Gonna Geek Network is a fantastic podcast network that has a variety of shows. And in the latest Legends news stream, they talk about a bunch of news from the week of April 6th. Bunch of geeky topics, including some spoilers, hint, hint, could be about the world of entertainment.
The world of entertainment.
All right, let's go ahead and dive into our final installment of the Budget Arc. Shall we do that?
I'll just put my Speedo on and I'll be right there.
All righty. All right, the budget is back. We missed a week of talking budget talk because SP had to go away and get his fun on in the sun.
Absolutely. Fun on in the sun. And we didn't talk about it, but we are part of a geeky network. I actually walked by a live shoot. It's an area that has a lot of active shoots going on, and we're not talking about bang bang shoot. We're talking about filming shoot. And it was great. If you're interested in video, I definitely encourage you to find a live shoot going on in your area that is not news related, and you will see a bunch of different stuff. It's great.
And I want to say right now, by the way, that those of you who may not be familiar with this, but maybe you are, maybe you're watching it right now, we have a video companion available on YouTube. And what you may not realize is that since I rearranged my pod arena, it has just been like everything that could have changed, and it has caused me all sorts of audio issues, but also video issues. And when we did the last podcast, you were like a day off of vacation, like maybe 2 days returned or something like that. And I have to say, like, I was having video problems where I was looking a bit washed out, but compared to your tan, it was stark contrast. So I am so happy to see that office white glow coming back to your face today, SP. It is reassuring to me.
It is, until I start getting out there doing yard work, if it ever stops raining around here. Yeah. So yeah, I was beat red actually. And I did put on the SPF 50 or whatever. And I was only out in the sun for collectively maybe 4 hours. And I took off my shirt for maybe an hour and a half. And I was so red. I was just peeling the last couple of days. So it's good to get a normal skin back, and looking forward to that summer tan glow at the pool.
Awesome. All right. So budget arc. Let's talk a bit budget here. And budget wise, today we are wrapping it up. If you are wrapping up your podcast, what we're going to talk about today is some of the costs you might want to consider if you are going to close it down, because more than likely, if you want to continue in the podcast realm, you probably want to continue putting a little bit of money into your podcast. It's essentially your resume, right, SP?
It is. If you're interested in keeping the podcast around for whatever reason, and some people aren't, but as you start off, the reason why we're talking about this now is even if you haven't started your podcast and you're listening to us, we want to make sure that you consider this as you go forward, because if you do go into it thinking, I want this to be around for a while for my resume, to tell everybody how I progressed or how much work I put in or whatever. And it does actually count for some things, even in business circles, that you're able to maintain a project on your own, whether or not the content is the same sort of stuff that your work is looking at or whatever. They can actually listen to you and determine if you are somebody that they want around for you, but also take a look at that episode count. And if it has 7 or 8, okay, probably not the greatest thing to have around, but if it's got 200, 300, 400, that's a lot of work. And if you want credit for it, go ahead and do that. So if you're looking at sustaining your podcast after you pod fade, whether you are planning on a pod fade or not, you have to consider where you want it to host. And that is one reason why I host my podcast on Libsyn, because I have pod faded a podcast, Voices of Defiance. It's on Libsyn. I pay the $5 a month versus the $20 a month. And as long as I pay that bill, that RSS feed is going to be valid and people can come see it. And we did it for everybody's enjoyment. So it's not just for me, it's for other people's enjoyment. So Libsyn allows that pull back the stick, go to a lower plan, and then you can maintain that for $60 a year right now. That's not bad. That's not bad at all. But there are other options to consider. You can transfer your files to archive.org. You can create another RSS feed off of FeedBurner or whatever, or maybe even hand roll it, whatever you want to do. And you can have all your episodes there. That is a possibility. So that's 2 different possibilities. But Stephen, you have pod faded a couple of podcasts. So I know you do it a little bit differently. So please tell everybody how you've done it.
So honestly, this is where my opinion is. It is an advantage to be self-hosting because of one specific reason, where when I ended a podcast, pod faded, whatever you want to call it, I had everything already set up on a self-hosting server. So what happens is I just go and I either roll that into the current project that I'm doing, which I have a web host for that, or I just tear it down, because at the time when I was self-hosting, I had a lot of traffic coming to this podcast. I had to go with more than just your basic average shared host web host plan. But when the traffic starts coming, it's just a matter of finding a different host that costs me a lot less, and the infrastructure is already there. It's just a regular server migration, which a lot of these web hosts cost, or web hosts include in the cost. So it's all right there. And for me, because I continued on a different project, the Gonna Geek site, I was able to just put that onto the hosting I was using for that, making it a heck of a lot easier. So very easy for me to do, and essentially cost me very little to keep running because I was already incurring those costs. So that's one way that I did that. One other thing that I like to point out to people here is decide why you want to keep it going, because that's something that you may not actually find that you have that big of an advantage to keep it on the internet. If all of a sudden you're like, you know what, I'm done. I'm probably not going back to podcasting. I'm just going to let it run its course for a little bit and then just pull it down from the internet. Then you can save yourself a few bucks on that. But the thing that I always like to remind people of is your fans, because you have people who are listening, and at any given time, you have people who are probably several episodes behind. So when you are considering closing down a podcast, even if you think that you're never going to podcast again, my rule of thumb is to plan on keeping it going for at least 6 months afterwards in some form. And the reason for that is twofold. Number one, you're doing your fans a favor, and you're really respecting the fact that they might be a few episodes behind, and you're going to let them catch up before all of a sudden they can't get that anymore. And then the second reason is sometimes you just need to recharge your batteries, and you might decide, okay, I wasn't ready to close it down.
That's right. So with Voices of Defiance, recently, within the past month, I had the opportunity, even though the podcast had been pod faded for over 6 months, we actually did another episode. We were both, Shannon and I both went to conventions. Shannon actually met and spoke to Jamie Murray, which was one of the stars of Defiance, and she wanted to tell her fans about it on Voices of Defiance. She has moved on to other projects, as have I. I mean, Better Podcasting is a perfect example. You know, pretty much when Voices of Defiance closed down, we started Better Podcasting. She went from Voices of Defiance to Sci-Fi Boneyard, and that is a podcast that she does with her husband and my former co-host on Voices of Defiance as well, Sean. And they decided that because it was so Defiance related, that they wanted to make sure that the fans of, or the listeners of Voices of Defiance had a chance to hear about the experience. So we put that episode out at Voices of Defiance. And because I hosted with Libsyn, the RSS feed was still valid.
Yeah.
And all I had to do was shove that new episode in there, and boom, it dropped just like a new episode. And that was an example of something that I believe was about 7 months from pod fade. Now, do we have any plans for another episode? No, we don't. But if there is a reason to podcast again, then we can bring it back. Like if they do a made for TV movie or something like that. I doubt that, by the way. But if they do that, then we can come back and do that. And I'm do an episode on it. And I am fine with keeping that feed out there, that feed valid. And oh, by the way, the stats, we're still getting downloads.
Exactly.
And from the original 50 episodes that we did. And it's not bots, it's actual people. I can tell that in the stats. So people are enjoying it. Now, I can't say 2 years from now if it'll be the same way or not, but people are enjoying it now. So I'm glad I kept it going.
Yeah. And you bring up a very good point. You may just decide to move on projects, which is something that happened with me. I used to do a comic book website, or a website and a podcast, and I decided not to do that anymore, and we closed that down and everything. Well, what has happened a couple of times is the GonnaGeek.com podcast. I do that with a former co-host of mine on the comic book podcast, as well as a host who was a regular co-host or guest host on the show. So what we've done a couple of times, and we don't really do it anymore, but after we closed down the Fanboy Buzz podcast, what we did was when we did a Gonna Geek podcast episode that we thought, you know what, some of these Fanboy Buzz fans who might still be subscribed might be interested in this. We took the Gonna Geek episode, then we recorded a special intro and outro saying, hey, Fanboy Buzz fans, we're over on Gonna Geek. We thought you might be interested in this. If you like this, please find us over there. So it's a great tool if you keep the feed active to maybe try to retain some of your audience and maybe try to get them to check out your new project. And then maybe all of a sudden that spark comes back and you're like, you know what? I do want to talk about comics again. And then you still got your feed active. So there are definitely benefits to keeping it going, especially if you are planning to continue podcasting at all.
And I want to bring up a point that you mentioned of self-hosting, and then you can just continue to self-host. What if you're done with web development? You just don't want a web page or anything like that. Here's the flip side to what Steven has said about keeping it self-hosted and just costing whatever the self-host is. If you don't want anything to do with that, and you're hosting with Blueberry, Podbean, or Libsyn particularly, you can keep those going and then point your URL, which I still advocate having. So Voices of Defiance, I still have that. And I point that towards the Gonna Geek webpage that is Voices of Defiance. And so I can do that. But if I didn't have the Gonna Geek website available, which I'm entirely grateful for, by the way, Stephen, I can point that towards the Libsyn page that I have for Voices of Defiance. It's not a very good web page, but it is a web page. So you can do that as well. There's a lot of different options. The key here is to plan on whatever option that you want to do in the end and make sure that that is available to you. Now, I still have a Voices of Defiance web page. It's voicesofdefiance.com. And I believe it points to its own. I just said it points to Gonna Geek. It doesn't yet. It's going to. I'm going to shut that down. It's been 6, 7 months, 8 months or whatever since we last podcast, and I'm just going to point it to the network. And that's something that I wanted to bring up, is that I'm hosting as part of the posts, at least as part of the Gonna Geek network. So as part of a network, if that network continues to be there and that page continues to be there, you don't have to pay for web hosting. And that's another plus. But if you don't have that and you're a solo podcast and it's just one site that's wrapped up in itself, it's going to cost you a little money for a web page. It's going to cost you a little bit of money to keep the URL going. So just include that in your costs, whatever they are. So for me, it's $60 a year for the RSS feed for Libsyn, and it's $15 or whatever it is for the URL. So I'm spending $75 per year to keep Voices of Defiance still out there.
Right. So you bring up a couple of great things within your point there. And number one is, just to spell it out, the domain. We talked about that. You really should own a domain. So what are you going to do with that domain? In my opinion, even if for some reason you decide not to do an RSS anymore, or you decide I'm not going to host the media files anymore, I do not see any reason why it is not worth the $10 to $20 a year to keep that domain, because you may, for one, you may end up later down the road. It might not be this year. It may not be the next year. You might end up using that for something else. Maybe it's not a podcast. Maybe it's a situation that you're like, you know what? This podcast that I had talking about how to paint walls, I might do some videos about how to paint walls instead. So you've got the brand established and somebody else hasn't gone and scooped it. So it's totally worth it to me to spend that $10 to $20 a year to retain that domain. And the second thing of it is if you do have web hosting going and you are closing the project and you're not going to use it for something else, you're not transitioning to away from a podcast to something else, my suggestion for that is to plan to close the website, because it's just an expense you don't need to have. Take the domain, point it to the media host, because all of these media hosts are going to give you some form of basic website, and save yourself a few bucks. Take the domain, point it to your Libsyn page or your Podbean or whatever, because why incur that web host or that web expense if you have no real reason anymore to have that content on display?
Yeah, that is exactly what I plan to do with Voices of Defiance, and just haven't completed the transition yet. And then another expense that we sometimes have on podcasts, we talked about it before, is a voicemail. You know, if you can get a Google Voice number, they're free. That's a good way to go. But I particularly use, on all my podcasts that we have voicemails now, I use a Call 8 number. That's CALL8.com. It's $2 a month. And because I want the fans, the listeners, to be able to get a message back, and we've had a couple messages on Voices of Defiance, by the way, and just say, hey, thanks for everything that you did. I was listening to your final episode and I decided to click call on the number that showed up in the show notes. Great. You know, that's perfect. Thank you very much. And I can distribute that to all the hosts, and it's great. So I would plan to keep that voicemail active for a year, maybe two, and you don't have to, but like I said, that's $2 a month for me. So that's $25 a year, basically. So I'm up to $100 so far on my sustaining Voices of Defiance every year. Now, is that a $100 check at once? No, it's not. It's $5 a month for Libsyn. It's $2 a month for the voicemail, and it's $15 a year for the domain registration. So it's really like $7 a month and then $15 a year. And that is what we're up to right now for Voices of Defiance. Now, Steven's got a little bit different model because he actually has a lot of web hosting.
Yeah, for sure. So we've talked a lot about more soft costs, non-material costs. Well, what other sort of material costs might you have incurred from your podcast over the years? Maybe you've purchased some microphones. Maybe you've purchased a recorder. Maybe you've purchased a variety of other physical items. What are you going to do with those? And this is where maybe you end up absorbing some of those costs. Because if you are totally done with podcasting and you have no other reason to keep this gear, why not sell it? Right, SB?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So for the listener of the podcast, what Stephen and I just did is we held up some of our gear. Stephen held up literally a bouquet of microphones. That was pretty cool. And I held up a couple of the digital recorders I happen to have on hand right now. But yes, you can go on eBay. You can go to podcast groups. There's actually one in particular on Facebook that you can go to and actually sell trade gear on. You can go to right now the Google Plus community, podcast community, and do that. But yeah, you can sell the gear and recoup some of that expense back. And there's another thing that you can do. You can give it away. You can give it away to co-hosts. You can give it away to friends. You can give it away to schools. You can give it away to different places. And even if it's a stupid preschool or a kindergarten and you know that gear is going to be ruined, they're going to have a ton of fun actually picking that stuff up and doing their fake rock star singing and stuff like that. So they can make great toys too.
They're not going to rock star sing. They're going to pretend to be podcasters like all children do, right?
Yeah. Well, your kid definitely does. And I know Sean's kid does too. That's great. These little kids behind the microphone stuff. So yeah, they can do that as well. And it is great. So just if you have it laying around the house and you know for a fact that you are not going to do anything about it, get rid of it, sell it, get some money back, or donate it. That's great too. It's what we say on the Gonna Geek Network with comic books. If you're not going to have them anymore, there are definitely places that you can donate comic books that do a lot of good.
I agreed. And I'm going to refer back to the question that we said earlier. Are you sure you're done? Because you may get that spark again. So my recommendation on gear purging is actually bigger than my recommendation previously. I actually recommend for your gear you wait a year, because I have done hobbies before where I have been bored with it, and it's about the year mark that I start to get that hankering. I'm like, you know what? I'd like to pick that up again. And that sucks if you got to go buy the gear all over. So I actually recommend waiting about a year before you do sell it. That's my personal advice.
Yeah, you can do that, or you can purge down to like your mobile gear if you happen to have mobile gear versus studio gear, and just keep it on hand just to restart the salivation going in your mind at any one time. You can do that. So there's also a lot of podcasts now. We don't personally do it, and most hobby podcasters that I know of actually don't do it, but some actually ask for donations. A lot of podcasts do. It's just you have to have a certain listener base to make it worth it and everything like that. But a couple of the big ones are like Patreon and PayPal. Just remember, if you have those accounts going and you have pod faded and you know you're not going to have another podcast out there, it's up to you on whether you want to keep them out there or not. Personally, I think you should probably take them down within, 6 months or something like that, because you're not offering any new content.
I agree.
If you're getting thousands and thousands of downloads because you're like Dan Carlin's History, I mean, that's another issue altogether. And that's it is a professional podcast, basically. But if you're just doing a hobby podcast, you got a couple hundred downloads or something like that, just don't keep that money coming in from people that you're not providing any content for. That's just my personal opinion.
I agree 100%. And if by chance you're in a situation that you feel that you should keep it going, my recommendation is to make it abundantly clear wherever you are accepting those that you are no longer producing content and that you have no plans to continue producing content, because you're taking somebody's money. Respect it. Be fair. Make sure that they know what they can expect to get out of that. They can expect to get a sustained archive. Make that clear rather than misleading people that they might end up possibly getting a new show. So
yeah, you bring up a good point there. If this is costing me, for instance, $100 a year, and if I have a couple of donors that are willing to give a couple of bucks a month, that would offset those costs. So that is right up front there and would help out. But no, you have to state that you are using it for sustaining the archive and not for any new content.
Absolutely. So quickly, just sort of recapping what we talked about, because there's a bunch of different points, and we touched a little bit on sort of the process of closing down a podcast, but it goes hand in hand. So first thing that you want to remember is the media hosting. What are you doing? What do you plan to do? And if you plan to keep that media host online, you're probably looking on an average podcast for an archive, probably between $5 to $10 a month. Web hosting. If you have an actual website, how long do you want to leave that website going? You're probably looking again somewhere in the neighborhood of $5 to $10 a month for an archived website, because you can get some really cheap deals on some hosting packages that offer little bandwidth. Your voicemail. What are you planning on doing with that? That could be free. It could be, again, somewhere about $5 a month, I would say, because you're not really getting any voicemails anymore. So to be fair, what, about $5 max?
Max. I wouldn't go any higher than that. If it's higher than that, I'd shut the number down.
My favorite one, the domain. It's going to cost you less than a cup of coffee a month. You're looking at $10 to $20 a year.
Now, wait a minute. Are we talking like the McDonald's coffee, like the $1, the Tim Hortons coffee, or are we talking like the frou-frou Starbucks, Seattle's best sort of
it's
stuff?
It's going to cost you a hell of a lot less than a frou-frou coffee a month. I can tell you that.
Okay. Just clarify that.
You're looking at a couple, like $1 to $2 a month max. And do your just email me, Steven@betterpodcasting.com. I'll tell you the two providers that I deal with that, in my opinion, offer a really good fee. A really good price. Then finally, the offsetting of your costs, how you might be able to get things back a little bit. Maybe sell your gear. Maybe you continue that donation page, making it abundantly clear what the listener can expect to get. So that kind of recaps your closing down. I suppose you could just cancel everything all at once. And that would be your method to closing it down. But we are talking about budgeting, how to close it down respectfully and responsibly.
Absolutely. And we might have something more to say about how to close it down with your audience in another podcast. But for right now, that's about all we have. If you have any questions on it, you can email us at podcast@betterpodcasting.com.
Absolutely. Let's go into the download.
I'm down with the low.
Welcome to this week's Better Podcasting Download.
Alrighty, it's the download this week. SP, what do we got going on?
Well, we have kind of a story to tell you, and it begins with a post that Daniel J. Lewis put out there in the middle of last month. Basically, there's no number one in iTunes New and Noteworthy. Everybody's been saying, oh, we're number one in iTunes New and Noteworthy, and it's us. And other people are saying, don't even, if that is your goal, Photoshop is your friend. Don't even bother with trying to fake it in there or whatever. And I have a little of integrity, and I'm not one to Photoshop myself in New and Noteworthy. Nor do I really care if I'm in New and Noteworthy, because we do this for fun. This is fun for us. We're not in it for the accolades. We're not in it for the awards. We're in it to hang out together and to talk to people that are interested in this stuff, because we are interested in this stuff. Heck, at the gym today, I was listening to podcasts about podcasting. It's what I do at the gym every time I'm in there. I get my geek on. I get my podcast on. That's what I do. So anyway, Daniel J. Lewis, he had this great post saying, look, there is no number one. And he goes throughout this great thing about there's actually no thing on there that says number one. And that New and Noteworthy is a reward and shouldn't be a goal. And you shouldn't be focused on, you really shouldn't. You should be focused on creating good content that people are going to want to hear. And that's really the goal of podcasting, whether you're a hobby podcaster or you're a professional podcaster and you're trying to do it for a lot of money. So there is that. So that got me thinking, if you take a look at the stats on a podcast and you take a look at how that might translate into New and Noteworthy, like they say, it's iTunes reviews. It's not actually. iTunes reviews won't help you with that. Actually, New and Noteworthy is kind of a manual thing, and it's not automatic, and they choose which featured podcasts go on there and stuff like that. That's part of the Apple office and nobody really knows what their process is. They just kind of make it up as they go along. It's like pornography, right? I don't know what it is, but I know what it is when I see it. I can't define it, but I know what it is I see.
I think what they do is they have like 6 dice, all with different numbers on it. They roll the dice, and then that's the iTunes ID that they put on there.
That's as good of explanation as any that I've heard.
That's not true, by the way. Let's clarify that. That's not true. Right.
Supposedly, it has to do, your ranking in your category depends on how many total subscribers you have all time to your podcast, and then how many subscribers that you've had recently. And it's some combination of that, and it pumps you up on the rankings, whatever. So if you're going to game the system, and I don't advocate doing this at all, because your game is to create new content. But if you're trying to game the system, the game is to get subscribers. And by doing that is to create good content. So be entertaining, be funny, be informative, and have a product that people are going to want to download. And you've kind of solved all your problems right there. But my standpoint is, what does this all really matter? So if you go to the Feed podcast, which is Libsyn's official podcast, Rob Walsh, the VP of Libsyn, he gives every other week, which is how the podcast is released every 2 weeks. He gives a certain portion of the stats from the previous month. One of the stats is what percentage of downloads come from Apple. And it's a combination of Apple Core Media and iTunes. And really, it's been about 70%, right? For a lot of the podcasts. And I haven't done a comparison of all of our podcasts that we have access to the data, but I'm just going to go down the better podcasting stat percentages. So we were wondering, hey, how do we stack up? Not all shows are the same, by the way, so might not be indicative of your performance, but I was wondering, so in today's day and age, when Android phones are becoming more prevalent, and that Google Play is becoming out there. It's a slow rollout, I guess, and we haven't really heard about that in a while. So how exactly are we breaking down the stats? So I went to the Better Podcasting stats, and I was like, okay, how much percentage do we have with Apple? And this is a combination of Apple Core Media and iTunes if you look in your Libsyn stats. So I looked it up, and we are sitting at about 23%. And I was like, wow, that's low. And it is low. So
I know what it is. I just thought of it. Our parents downloaded on the Windows machine.
Oh,
that's what it is, right?
Right. And then anybody in a Linux machine downloaded there too, right?
No, I just mean, like, isn't our audience primarily our parents downloading it over and over, right?
Well, my sister too.
Okay.
I think your sister downloads a couple times too, right? So I could see that. Actually, my youngest sister is mentally handicapped, but she can operate an iPad. And I brought up our video during Christmas, and she was watching us over and over and just laughing and chuckling and stuff. It was great. I mean, she was like really rolling. My brother's on the iPad and everything. It was great. So I could see her finding the podcast app and finding the podcast and just downloading it or playing it constantly over and over again. So that actually isn't surprising to me. So anyway, I was taking a look at the stats, and I was like, 20% Mozilla. That's a lot. And it is a lot compared to other things. I'm like, why? I don't understand. So that brings up a point, doesn't it, Stephen?
Yeah, it does. So here's the thing with stats in general. And you have to remember that, yes, Rob Walsh did put out this information about iTunes, but my little joke that I was making there about our family members downloading it was actually to illustrate a point, because stats aren't always so clear cut. You may not follow the norm. You may find that, yes, the industry does have so many percentage of iTunes users, but that may not be your percentage, your actual percentage, and you may differ a little bit there because it could be an external factor. Maybe you do have those friends who download you several times a week from different platforms and subscribe to you everywhere. Maybe you do have a mom who loves to hear Jimmy on the tubes and downloads it several times.
Turn Jimmy on.
Exactly. Or maybe you have a web scraper. This is a topic that we've been waiting to talk about. And I think that this is a really good opportunity too, because our very own Libsyn stats have been impacted by a web scraper. So what is a web scraper? A web scraper is essentially a fake website that is posted up. Might look like yours, it might look like something else, but it's leeching your content. A lot of times it's done through an RSS feed. So you have an RSS feed if you're doing a podcast, and if you don't, do it now.
Because it's not a podcast without an RSS feed.
So you have an RSS feed, so it makes it fairly easy for somebody to write a script that goes in, takes your content, and puts it on their website. Now, what is the purpose of that? Well, number one, it could be so that they have more content on their site and people stumble across them instead of you. It could be for SEO purposes, or it could be an ad making scheme. And this is actually something that, why do I know about this? Because I've encountered this with the Gonna Geek website before. We had a web scraper, and what the web scraper was doing was they were taking our content and they were leeching it. All of the different content on there. And one of the things that it did manage to stumble into was better podcasting. And that's where this Mozilla download that SP speaks of came up, because the scripting that they used on to web scrape us was showing up as Mozilla hits. So when you are looking at your stats, if all of a sudden you're getting a bit of an increase and something's going on, dive into it. Maybe you have yourself a web scraper, and you're going to want to be cautious about that, because while it might be exciting to all of a sudden go from 150 downloads a week to consistently 500,
we've been discovered.
Where did that jump come from? Look into it, because while what's the saying? 2 is a pattern, 3 is a trend. Is that what the saying is?
Yes.
Something like that. I think.
Something like that.
While it may end up being, no, it's not pattern. Anyways, it's, who knows? There's a saying about it, and now you know that there's a saying about it, and you don't know what that saying is. But what it is you may get lucky, and you may end up getting a bit of a bump all of a sudden. That happens in podcasting, and then it tapers off. But if you had a massive bump and it's consistently on afterwards, why did you get that bump? You need to find out what that reason was, because it could be legit. Maybe all of a sudden you got a guest on there and a bunch of people subscribed, or it could be something like a web scraper. And so that's where, when you do have statistics and you can look into it, you can see how you compare. For us, we looked in, we saw the Mozilla client. That's weird. Why so many people using Mozilla? Then we ended up finding the web scraping and things like that. So it happens. Honestly, unless you are very tech savvy, you're not a damn thing you're going to be able to do about it, because it is essentially just accepted that if you get scraped, you have to ride it out. I'm not trying to, toot my own horn or anything, but I am tech savvy, and I did find a way to deal with it.
It was pretty ingenious too. And we might talk about it sometime in the future, but I think we're safe in keeping that here for now. And by the way, it's 1 is an incident, 2 is a coincidence, 3 is a pattern.
That makes more sense than 3 is a pattern, and 4 is, I don't know. I'll make
4 is enough.
Exactly, 4 is enough. Like, thank you very much.
Half is 8 is enough. Yes, and I did Google that. I didn't get off the top of my head. I'll be honest with that. So yeah, so we had this web scraper, and it did impact our stats, and it actually took us about a week, 10 days or whatever, to really figure out what's going on, because you never know when you're going to get a spike out of anything. So we had that going on, but to get back to the stats in the Mozilla, I was like, well, how much does this really impact us? Because I'm still curious, and going back to that iTunes, we should be at 70%. If you take out all of the Mozilla downloads and you just take the percentage of what's left in the Apple Core Media and the iTunes, we're still only at 27%.
Right.
So that is still low on the iTunes thing. And maybe it's because of where we're marketed and where we're highlighted and where we're not, that sort of thing. Every podcast is different. And as you launch it and as you get up and going, those things can happen. However, I think it's indicative, and this is just a single data point, but I think it's indicative the fact that Apple is pulling back, being the king of podcasts. So if you have a new podcast, I'd be very interested to hear if you're riding at that 70% in the iTunes or not. We have a few new podcasts on the Gonna Geek Network, and if we're able to pull that data from that, we will pull that and get back to you at a later date. And we will definitely be talking more in depth on podcast stats as we go along. We actually have an active project going on for that. So stay tuned for that. I won't give an exact date because we still have to do a few things on it, but more stats will be coming at you. And I just want to thank, again, Rob Walsh from Libsyn for going over all those stats every other episode.
Yeah.
I love them. Like your average, for instance, okay, the medium download numbers you should get for a podcast are about 160 right now. That means half the podcasts out there get more than 160 downloads per episode after 4 weeks, and half of them get under 160. And if you want to know the average, because there's some huge podcasts out there, it's 1,800 a month. And that is a good, the stats are good, I believe, for March or February or March 2016. I can't remember. So that is if you're looking for benchmarks, those are your benchmarks. But again, we'll get more into stats at a later date.
Absolutely. So there you go. There's your roundabout, taking you all over the map, better podcasting download for this week. And if you have something that is very interesting that you think we would love to talk about for a Better Podcasting Download, please email us. It is podcast@betterpodcasting.com. We are always looking for listener input, and a Better Podcasting Download suggestion is a great way to do that. You've heard it before. We've talked about multiple topics within the download section. It's a fun section for us to keep you in the loop of what's going on in the realm of podcasting.
Absolutely. We like the realm of podcasting. Hey, Steven.
Yeah.
Are you ready for a pod in the back?
Let's do a pod back.
Okay, I got a pod. I'm going to put it on my back.
He was holding up an iPod, folks. He was holding up an iPod, and he literally put it on his back.
That's how you roll with SP around here.
Well, there's our 27% downloads right there. The Twitter sphere was a bustling for Stargate Pioneer this week, wasn't it, SP?
It is. Everybody likes to talk to the Stargate Pioneer, just like everybody likes to talk to the Chris Farrell. That's at the Chris Farrell. He's been on the podcast before. If you're missing him or whatever, or you want him back on, just tweet him at the Chris Farrell, and maybe we can get him, rustle him off his couch, or watching the baseball game, which he's doing, and get him on to the microphone again. But
actually, you bring up a good point. We've never mentioned that hate mail should actually be direct to him directly, right?
Chris@gonnageek.com.
Yeah.
Or I'm just thinking that maybe at some point in time, Stephen will make this email functional as well. The Chris Farrell @gonnageek.com. Nope, it's just going to be the Chris@gonnageek.com. Okay. So folks, Chris@gonnageek.com. And if you want Stephen to make an email called the Chris Farrell @gonnageek.com, you can email Stephen@gonnageek.com.
All right. So let's just talk about the Twitter's back.
The tweet back. Okay. So Jason Bryant, who is a huge NCAA wrestling podcaster, he's got, I don't know, at least 14 shows, and I think it's more than that on his network, and it's Matt Talk Network. We interface a little bit on some of the podcasts about podcasting areas, and he just tweeted me a couple of tweets, and he ended with, love the show of Better Podcasting and the contributions to Ask the Podcast Coach that we happen to make from time to time. So thank you very much for listening to Better Podcasting, Jason, and to tweet us back like that. Thank you very much. And that's just a lesson to people out there. If you enjoy the content from a podcaster, reach out to them, no matter how they've made themselves available. Leave them an iTunes review. 5 stars would be great. Or, send them a tweet, an email, or whatever, and just say, hey, like the last episode and keep up the great work. It really helps podcasters, even us, Stephen and I, but it really helps podcasters that may not get a lot of feedback.
Yeah.
And your one email might be the highlight of their podcasting career. So keep that available, keep that out there, and just make sure you give feedback to people. And you can find Jason at Matt Talk Network. And he, like I said, if you are into college wrestling, he is the guy. So see all the great shows on there. And go Gophers!
I have no idea what you're talking about, so I'm Canadian.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. Let me put it in terms you can
understand?
Yeah,
comprehend?
pretty much. Yeah, I was thinking comprehend,
okay.
really. But, okay. Go!
All right. Well, thank you very much for that feedback. And just for the audience, the demand was high over the last 2 minutes. We have now the Chris Farrell at GonnaGeek.com. And also, if you are British, the Chris Farrell at GonnaGeek.com. THEE. So take your pick. Send your hate mail there for better podcasting, because that's where we want it to. No, seriously, any feedback that you have for us, we always appreciate it. Whether or not you have a suggestion or a constructive criticism or another idea, another way to handle something, absolutely, we will take your feedback. You can email podcast@betterpodcasting.com, tweet us at betterpod, or facebook.com/betterpodcasting. And of course, you can find all of this at betterpodcasting.com. So that is taking us to the end of the show, but before we do wrap up, we will reiterate that the contest that we have for the Logitech C920 does go until May 2016, the end of May 2016. You can email contest@betterpodcasting.com. You heard the criteria at the beginning. I will not bore you again with it. Please send off your email to us. And also, if you are shopping around for a rack for your rack gear, what can you do there, SB?
So go to madeinfarmington.com, go to the audio racks area. They actually have a separate website called audioracks.com, and use the coupon code when you check out BetterPod10. That's the words BetterPod, and 10 is in the number 10, 10, and you will get 10% off on your purchase. And actually, coincidentally, right after we get off the recording this podcast, I am going to order a new one because I actually have more gear that I need to put in there. So I'm going to get a bigger one, and it'll be fun unwrapping that because they're huge.
You and I have had a lot of changes to our setup recently. We won't bore everybody with it. Well, maybe we should put out a bonus feature or something sometime for that.
Oh yeah, like a video only.
Yeah,
I think that's a good idea. Yeah.
So keep your eyes on all of our places that you can contact us, which you can find at betterpodcasting.com. So that does do it for episode 23 of Better Podcasting. You're 23 now. It continues to be boring. I am Stephen John Drew.
23 is not a boring number because it is a prime number, and I am Stargate Pioneer.
Till next time. Bye.
See ya.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Better Podcasting. We want to hear from you. You can find all of our contact information at betterpodcasting.com. If you like the show, please consider giving us a 5-star review in iTunes. Thanks for listening, and we will see you again next week.